Welcome back to this special hour-long episode of Political Exchange. From our Johannesburg studios, we continue our conversation with South African President Jacob Zuma. Mr. President, how confident are you that the recent election for the AU chair hasn't damaged unity in the long run? There were sentiments on the continent that South Africa perhaps acted, as a kind of big bully boy on the continent. Are you worried that the way in which the elections happened would damage long-term unity on the continent and could perhaps, scupper South Africa's chances for getting onto the Security Council because we might not get the backing of Francophone African countries?
Not at all. I'm not worried. I think what has happened, firstly, I think it's important to say AU is a democratic institution. We were going for elections. Elections, there's contestation. And I don't know why people would think if there's a contestation, then that would bring about disunity. Not at all. I think people contested very strongly. I think our campaign was based on our political views and what we believed needed to happen to the AU. We needed some change in the AU. We needed some transformation. We needed to bring in fresh leadership. We needed to look at how Africa positions itself in terms of its independence, less influence from anywhere else. Very important. How do we deepen Pan-Africanism in Africa? And then how do we deepen unity? How do we deal with the problems in the continent? That was informed by our own experience in terms of what has been happening in the continent. And when we were campaigning, and we campaigned very vigorously, as like in any other campaign, these were the issues we were raising. What do we think the AU must do? The fact that we were able to win the support, it means that people began to appreciate our political objective as the region, southern region. And if you were there at the end of the elections, you would have seen how much this continent united. In fact, if the continent was divided, you would not have had the kind of the majority we had to our candidate. It was not just by, skin of the teeth kind of getting the majority. It was overwhelming. And that has, I think, brought a new kind of situation in terms of how countries are going to relate to one another. I think we're going to have an opportunity to really, in other words, work out a new way of bringing about the kind of activities in the continent that is going to make the continent to move forward. So I've got absolutely no worry. In fact, if anything, it is going to unite the continent. It's not correct to say South Africa was bullying. Never bully anyone. We went to persuade. Nobody can say we came in and said, vote for us, whether I like it or not. Not at all. We put across what we thought were the objectives that our candidate would be able to do for Africa, not for South Africa. We're dealing with the issues in Africa. And South Africa has always dealt with these issues. And we've not dealt with it because we want to be given something back. We are not looking for the elections of the Security Council. That issue has not arisen. We don't work in a manner that we begin to solve other problems by solving others. We're dealing with the AU, which we thought had become sluggish, flat-footed. We needed it to be on its toes. We needed it to look at issues. If you look for an example, the issues, I don't know how people looked at this, the Cote d'Ivoire situation, we got into deeper problems there because the AU was not quick to move into the issues. It even took positions that were not necessarily the position of all of us, were not agreed positions. In Libya, very much flat-footed, to a point that you then had other regions coming in, producing the kind of the results which we could have diverted if AU could move in a particular way. So I'm just saying there are very practical issues that we were among those who could no longer just stand by and look at things deteriorating. So it was important. It was the question of the political life of the continent, the unity of the continent. So I disagree with people who say Africa is going to be divided. It's actually going to be more united.
Okay, Mr. President, let's just park the Africa issues. Let's bring it back home to South Africa. We're now joined in Cape Town. We have a business leader, Mr. Gareth Ackerman. He's the chairman of Pick n Pay. His question, of course, relates to the issue around food security. Mr. Ackerman.
Good evening, Mr. President.
Good evening.
The question I really would like to ask you, which is changing the subject totally, is that there's been a lot of debate in South Africa and conflicting messages coming from the government and your various coalition partners about nationalization of land, land redistribution and land tenure. But there does not appear to be much discussion or solid thinking from within the government or your partners on the issue around food security. We believe this is a really critical issue for the region, and we would like to know really what are your government's plans in respect of food security and providing assurances and support to our farmers, and particularly making sure that there's affordable food for the population of South Africa. If you look at the last couple of days, the US is now going into drought and there could be severe shortages of grain. Fortunately, we had a good crop this year. But I do think it's a big, big issue and something that we need to get some clarity and leadership on.
In fact, that issue is being discussed. The issue of food security is a continuous item on the agenda. Maybe it did not feature very prominently in the policy conference, partly because there were other issues that took the priority. Is an issue that we are dealing with. There are programs that are looking at how do we deal with this issue of food security. In fact, it's not just in South Africa only. We are discussing it jointly with the region as to how do we deal with this issue. We are interacting with the farmers to discuss that issue. So it's an issue that is uppermost in our priorities. It's not the issue that we have forgotten about. We talk about it. I think we have plans as to what do you need to do. Part of the issues that we are dealing with, for an example, on the land issue, partly they are to address that. How do we make our land more productive? And how do we increase the participation of people in terms of agriculture, more land, so that they work on the land, and the aim is to create the food security. So it is the issue that is uppermost in our programs.
Mr. Ackerman, I understand you have a second question.
Well, it's more a follow-up to that than a second question. Mr. President, with the land restitution program, a huge amount of land has been taken out of production in this country, and the amount of food that's being produced has been reduced over the last couple of years. And added to that, there's been a huge amount of export of food out of South Africa, both to Europe and to Asia and to other parts of the world, all of which is reducing the amount of food available for South Africa and is going to result in food prices going up if there's a drought in other parts of the world. We understand that there's a policy issue from the government, but we really wanted to understand how is the government going to get its hands around it to make sure we get some practical application to the policy that is being put forward.
Well, there is a green paper that has emerged from the Rural Development Department to deal with the issue of land, which is crucial in terms of the production of food. We are also realizing that the method that we had adopted earlier, there were no follow-throughs in terms of ensuring that the land that was, for an example, bought for the people who needed land, how they were followed in terms of how to utilize the land. We realized that some of the land that was taken away became not productive. The policies that we are now coming up with are to encompass all of that as to how are we going to ensure that even when people get the land, even if it is their own, how do we help them to ensure that the land do not reduce its capacity to produce, but we are able to make it to be even more productive. And there has been an agreement between the emerging farmers and the old experienced farmers that we must work together with the government. We are working towards emerging with that. I'm sure when the green paper becomes the policy that comes out, it will be able to articulate all of these. But there are programs that are going on at this point in time, because there is high consciousness that in fact South Africa, that used to export, it is importing more food. And we must deal with that. And I think there's a general agreement that we've got to resolve that issue.
Mr. President, let's stick with the issue of land. Now, the policy conference of the African National Congress did flag the issue of the willing buyer, willing seller mechanism not being adequate. And a number of mechanisms have come out. To what extent have you canvassed the potential change in policy with the key stakeholders? Have you met with the key stakeholders in this regard? And what are the changes that we are likely to see in this regard?
Well, we are discussing the matter with the stakeholders. And we have said, as I say, there's a green paper that is emerging, which we are asking everyone to participate so that it becomes a collective product that will come from all of us. we are feeling that it is important to address the issue, because if the issue is not addressed, it begins to create anxiety where people begin to say things about the issue of land. What we cannot do is to emerge with something that is not within the framework of our constitution and the framework of our laws. That is why the process of the discussion, which must end up with us agreeing as to what is it that we need to do. Because if we do not deal with the matter, particularly because we have said the willing seller, willing buyer method that we had come up with earlier did not sufficiently address the issues, how then could we address it better? We don't want to impose our ideas. We want the participation of all South Africans, because it is an important issue. It is an issue that must be addressed, and I haven't felt that there is a reluctance to anyone to participate. In fact, the stakeholders are saying, let us discuss, let us come with an understanding that will make all of us feel happy about how we deal with the question of the land. But
there has been a sense that we don't really have a sense of what amount of land belongs to the state. You know, how far is that process of auditing how much land actually belongs to the state, what we've done in terms of redistributing land, and of course what commercial land is available? Mr. President, can you give us any kind of timeline on when we're likely to have a proper audit of, you know, what land is in fact in state hands?
Well, there has been some audit, but we have discovered that we have not audited all the land, and that process is going on. I can't say this is the timelines, because the process, it does not seem to be very simple. But the process is going on, whilst we'll be discussing the land policy, but in terms of putting together the land that belongs to different departments, that process is ongoing. And I'm sure very soon it will come, because it relates also to other programs like the infrastructure, like housing, which are also urgent kind of programs that we are dealing with. But I can't put the time, but it's not going to be for a long time.
Okay, Mr. President, as you know, CNBC Africa is a Pan-African channel, and we cross now to Nairobi, Kenya, where we are joined by Professor Michael Chege. He's the advisor for the International Development Policy at Kenya's Ministry for Planning. Mr. Chege.
Thank you, Mr. President, for taking my question. The international consultancy firm, Ernst & Young, issued a report from Cape Town last month about economic growth in Africa, which is good news, as well as the fact that our continent is receiving amounts of foreign direct investment of the kind it never received before. The biggest drawback, however, is bad publicity internationally, which is making it impossible for even more investors to come. I have in mind in particular the developments in Zimbabwe, Madagascar, and DRC, which are part of SADC, and in our part of the continent, Somalia. This publicity costs us growth, it costs us investment, it costs us employment and profits. Mr. President, what can we do, first of all, to improve the publicity, but also to solve the underlying crisis in these countries which have been with us for so long?
Well, we are trying our level best to deal with those challenges. If you talk about the DRC, for an example, the Great Lakes countries are meeting on the 6th to discuss the current issue. I think there is a very strong feeling that even the rebels are agreeing for the ceasefire. So we are moving to deal with that. It has been a difficult issue, the DRC historically, But I don't think people are saying we can't do anything about it. They're doing something about it. Even the Somali issue, which has been very difficult, there has been a lot of progress made in the recent past. So it's no longer looking as it used to in the past. There was a very clear report in the last summit that Somalia is making some progress. So there is a hope that things are going to change in terms of reporting about Somalia. But if you talk about Zimbabwe, they are making progress. They've concluded, for an example, one of the important elements that need to be concluded, the constitution, which becomes an important instrument for elections. SADC is going to be meeting very soon in Maputo. I'm sure there will be a report that indicates that the situation is changing in Zimbabwe. We will have to take decisions as to then what happens, because we have to go for elections. There were specific things that Zimbabweans were dealing with, and they've been working hard towards ensuring that we are able to fulfill those demands that were put by the government of unity that was put in. With regard to Madagascar, I was in Mauritius, in Seychelles recently, wherein we actually had, after a long time, the two leaders meeting, Rajolina and Ravalomanana, to discuss the issues. We did not conclude. I'm going back there in a week's time, where we are actually hoping we'll have a final agreement to deal with the situation in Madagascar. What I think is important in the things that in Africa today could be looked at in one sense as bad news is that, unlike before, where we had problems, it was difficult to deal with. These days, we are dealing with those issues, whether at a regional level or at a continental level. There are no issues that are left unattended to. Any problem that arises today in the continent, we all come together to address those problems. I would imagine that those who report about Africa, if they could also report comprehensively, because if you just say there are problems as if nothing is being done, then it remains bad news. But if you say, yes, there are problems, but people are doing all they can to solve the problems, and there is progress, I think that will change the manner in which people look at us. The perceptions will change.
Mr. President, Professor Chege has a last question for us.
Mr. President, you mentioned, and I agree with your observation, that there should be more intra-African trade. At the moment, we have an alphabet soup of regional economic institutions, SADC, SACU, COMESA, East African Community, Indian Ocean Commission. All of these institutions have different tariff regimes, different internal taxes, fiscal policies, etc. The AU has required that all African countries streamline the regional economic grouping so that we can negotiate deals between ourselves and the rest of the world better. As the leader of the largest economy of South Africa, could you please let us know what you think we have not done that is right, and what we should be doing so that we move on this road much, much faster?
I think we have not moved faster enough in terms of discussing to streamline our different tariffs and other kind of things. We, for an example, were discussing about the possibility of establishing the kind of common market. Also discussing, as it were, how to streamline this. We are not on our own, because our friends out there still have some interest how these things are done. So it's not just us being sluggish, maybe in dealing with matters, but it's other people also who think, how do you do business with Africa? I think we need to emphasize our independence, how we could deal with ourselves and solve the problems. One of the issues that we have dealt with or discussed in the AU has been the question of the borders, for an example. How difficult in Africa to move from one country to the other, whilst we are talking about intra-trade. But we have agreed there are specific people who are looking at the question of how do we change the regimes at the borders, and how do we deal even with the currencies and everything. I am optimistic that, unlike in the past, there are issues on the table that we are actually discussing. for an example, if you talk about the 3 regions that have come together, they are busy working on how do we deal with these matters. The corridors that we are talking about, for an example, are touching each and every country. And we are looking at how do we relax the regimes at the borders. So I think more than any other time, this time around, we are doing something as Africans on our own. So I'm more optimistic that we are going to resolve these matters quicker than people realize.
Okay, Mr. President, we are joined now in Lagos, Nigeria, by economist Bismarck Rewani. He is the CEO of Financial Derivatives. Mr. Rewani?
Good evening.
Good evening.
Mr. President.
Yes.
My question is on the revision of your GDP forecast down to 2.9%. This is way below the sub-Saharan African average of 5.5%. Does this mean that we have structural or cyclical problems, and what is South Africa doing to address this at this point in time?
I think our percentage of our economic growth has been impacted on by the global economic problems. That has been the problem. That has actually put us into some difficulties of the slow growth. It's not because of our structural problems, whatever. It is an impact that is being made globally. Everybody is not growing very fast. I don't think we could be an exception. So even the manner in which we had forecast how we will be growing, that has been, in a sense, impacted upon by particularly the Eurozone, given our relationship with them. And we are working very hard to say, how do we try to raise it? And I don't think it's an easy matter to deal with. The fact that we are growing steadily, I think in itself, it shows the resilience of our economy, because other countries, some of them developed countries, are in trouble. We couldn't be an exception. I think that is the main thing that has actually, in a sense, looked at our growth. And we are working very hard, and I think we've got very vigorous plans to try to generate our economy even further so that it could grow more than what it is doing now.
Mr. President, we're taking a final question from Mr. Rewani in Lagos. Mr. Rewani.
Yeah, Mr. President, unemployment in South Africa is 24.9%. Part of this has been attributed to urban migration and also illegal immigration. How are you going to address this unemployment problem, first in the short run, and secondly, strategically in the long run?
Well, in the short run, I don't think we could do more than what I've just been explaining, how we are trying to put into operation our economic plans, the infrastructure nationally, and many other things that we're trying to do in a short while. That's what we're going to be doing. In the long term, I don't think you can deal with the issue easily of, for an example, the people who come to South Africa from the continent, from all over the world, who are part of the economic activities, more than the South African population. The long term is, in fact, what we have just talked about. How do we broaden our economy regionally and continentally? That, in the long run, is what is going to solve the problem of employment in South Africa. Because you cannot have South Africa in a region or continent that is economically strong whilst others are weak. The question is, how do we make other economies also grow so that they become part of the broader kind of economy, so that people don't rush to South Africa because there's no economic opportunities in their countries? That's the strategy of the intertrade infrastructure actually begins in the long run to address that kind of question.
Okay. We are now going to take questions from our studio guests. We just request that you be brief. Ibrahim Fakir is the Manager for Governance Processes at the Electoral Institute for the Sustainability of Democracy in Africa. Mr. Fakir.
Hi, good evening, Mr. President.
Good evening.
When you were elected President of the African National Congress in 2007 and President of the Republic in 2009, there were lots of concerns that this president's coming in and he doesn't in fact have a vision. Now, you've obviously gone at lengths to explain that the President of the African National Congress and the President of the Republic implements and leads the vision of the ANC. But surely, Mr. President, at some point, the President also imprints some kind of vision, some kind of leadership on the ANC. Otherwise, you'd merely be reduced to a facilitator, not a leader. So the question for me, Mr. President, is what is the vision of Jacob Zuma? What is the grand idea of the Jacob Zuma presidency, both in the ANC and for the Republic and for the continent? Thank you very much.
Well, I don't know in what way would you be looking at that, because in the ANC we do not emphasize individualism. You don't have a leader in the ANC. We've got a collective leadership in the ANC. We all make our efforts there. Many of the ideas, for an example, that are emerging as policy are ideas that have emerged. And you recall that as I was campaigning, I said we need to do things differently. And you will agree that we are doing things to some degree differently. We, for an example, introduced new departments that were very necessary to be there, split other departments. That's a kind of new way of looking at things. We have come with the new economic growth. We are talking about 6 drivers of the new economy. That's a vision that we have come up with as the collective. I have participated in that collective. I have given leadership in that collective. I don't think we could have a situation where there's one leader, one ruler, who deals with matter. In South Africa, unfortunately, or in the ANC in particular. We believe in that, and I think it has benefited the ANC, the country. It has benefited all of us. So there is a vision, very clear vision. We now have the national plan, which we didn't have at the time that we are referring to. That indicates the new vision that South Africa has.
Mr. President, I just wanted to ask you a final question. You have spent the better part of your life in the African National Congress. We know that the African National Congress is going to elections in December in Mangaung. What is the future for you going forward? You know, are you continuing to serve the African National Congress? What is post-Mangaung? What is the prospects for President Jacob Zuma?
As a cadre of the ANC, I will continue serving the ANC. As to what level, that is a decision of the ANC. We don't choose in the ANC. Of course, there could be people who do the choosing. That's a type of another teaching. In the ANC, the ANC decides that we nominate you. We have never said nominate me in the ANC. I don't think we have come across that. If you come across that, you must know it's a little bit alien to the ANC. In the ANC goes through the process, looks at its cadres, the leaders, those who are second layer, third layer, and it says, we believe this particular cadre must be in that position, and they nominate you. It is at that point that you then respond to the nomination. Do we accept or not? We don't campaign in the ANC for ourselves to say, look, I'm a very good person, please elect me. No, we don't do so. And I think that has been one of the best character of the ANC. And cadres that have been produced by the ANC, that have been processed by the ANC, certainly they will tell you what I'm telling you. I'm here to serve in the ANC. The ANC will decide at what level I serve, on what aspect I serve. I wait for the ANC. What I've not done in my life in the ANC, I've never defied the ANC when it says, Zuma, serve here. I always oblige.
Mr. President, given that this is a consultative engagement with you, I'm going to give the final word to a member of our studio audience, Lauren Sultan.
Good evening, Mr. President. My question this evening is this. In light of the recent debate over the preparedness of tertiary level learners, a lack of English competency has been identified as a precursor to poor academic literacy development at tertiary level. Research suggests that there is a strong correlation between a well-formed educational foundation in the mother tongue and subsequent success in academic performance. Although the language and education policy advocates for multilingualism, I believe that real-world experience reveals a huge gap between this idealistic theory and on-the-ground practice. And despite government's commitment to multilingualism and the promotion of language rights in all spheres of public life, the education sector does not totally reflect the multilingual nature of South Africa. What is your comment?
Well, my comment is that for a long time, other languages in South Africa were not recognized or not taken serious. That is the legacy that we are faced with. It is just 18 years that we have said, recognize all languages, encourage all languages. You know, in the past, the only languages in this country were English and Afrikaans. If you did not know these ones, it was your own business. But we have now said all languages, 11 of them that are recognized constitutionally, need to be developed. To develop a language coming from the kind of situation we come from, it's not an easy matter. I think it is beginning to pick up. It is absolutely true that a child which speaks Zulu, who must come up and become English speaker, would be different than a child who is a child of an English speaker, who comes in a language and just flows. I've got to work out to understand the language which is not my first language and begin to understand concepts and every other thing. So it is a little bit difficult. I think we are in the process. I don't think, precisely because of our history, we have even the infrastructure to help people to deal with the languages. There is even a problem that even if I am as fluent as I am in Zulu, I can't use it anyhow because people are not going to understand me. I think it's going to take a long time that we come there. What is important in my view is that there is an agreement, there is a framework, let us work on it. Let us encourage other languages so that we are able to communicate in the manner in which we do. Presently, if I spoke Sotho and I'm fluent in Sotho, we would be in difficulties. So that's why English at the moment becomes the way of communication. But we are working towards putting into practice that we are a rainbow nation. If I'm in South Africa, it would be an ideal thing that I could understand any language, Afrikaans, whatever, but it's a process. I think we would be getting there, but we need to invest in that process because no one must be disadvantaged because the language he or she speaks is not understood by others.
Well, that's where we have to leave it, Mr. President. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
That's it for our first edition of Political Exchange. Join us again tomorrow when we are in conversation with South Africa's Finance Minister, Pravin Gordhan. Thank you so much for joining us.